Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings, to today's continuation of the worst festival of all time ever, Part 3 of In the Hills, the Cities, by Clive Barker. Mick got out of the car and crossed in front of it, glancing at the track as he did so. There was a moment's hesitation, no more than a moment's, when his eyes flickered with disbelief before he turned toward the windscreen, his face even paler than it had been previously, and said, "Jesus Christ," in a voice that was thick with suppressed nausea. His lover was still sitting behind the wheel, his head in his hands, trying to blot out memories. Judd looked up, slowly. Mick was staring at him like a wild man, his face shining with a sudden icy sweat. Then Judd looked past him. A few meters ahead, the track had mysteriously darkened as a tide edged towards the car, a thick, deep tide of blood. Judd's reason twisted and turned to make any other sense of the sight than that inevitable conclusion, but there was no saner explanation. It was blood, in unendurable abundance, blood without end, and now in the breeze there was the flavor of freshly opened carcasses. The smell out of the depths of the human body, part sweet, part savory. Mick stumbled back to the passenger side of the VW and fumbled weakly at the handle. The door opened slightly, and he lurched inside, his eyes glazed. "Back up," he said. Judd reached for the ignition. The tide of blood was already sloshing against the front wheels. Ahead, the world had been painted red. "For fuck's sake, drive! Drive!" Judd was no longer attempting to start the car. "We have to look," he said, without conviction. "We have to." "We don't have to do anything," said Mick, "but get the hell out of here. This is not our business. Plane crash, there's no smoke. Those are human voices." Mick's instinct was to leave well enough alone. He could read about the tragedy in a newspaper. He could see the pictures tomorrow when they were gray and grainy. Today it was too fresh, too unpredictable. Anything could be at the end of that track, bleeding out. "We must..." Judd started the car while beside him Mick began to moan quietly. The VW began to edge forward, nosing through the river of blood, its wheels spinning in the queasy, foaming tide. "No," said Mick very quietly. "Please, please, no." "We have to," was Judd's reply. We must. Only a few yards away, the surviving city of Popolok was recovering from its first convulsions. It stared with 1,000 eyes at the ruins of its ritual enemy, now spread in a tangle of rope and bodies over the impacted ground, shattered forever. Popolok staggered back from the sight, its vast legs flattening the forest that bounded the stamping ground, its arms flailing the air. But it kept its balance, even as common insanity, woken by the horror at its feet, surged through its sinews and curdled its brain. The order went out. The body thrashed and twisted and turned from the grisly carpet of Podejevo and fled into the hills. As it headed into oblivion, the towering form passed between the car and the sun, throwing its cold shadow over the bloody road. Mick saw nothing through his tears, and Judd, his eyes narrowed against the sight he feared seeing around the next bend, only dimly registered that something had blotted the light for a moment. A cloud, perhaps? A flock of birds? Had he looked up at that moment, just stolen a glance out toward the northeast, he would have seen Popolok's head, the vast, swarming head of a maddened city, disappearing below his line of vision as it marched into the hills. He would have known that this territory was beyond his comprehension and that there was no healing to be done in this corner of hell, but he didn't see the city, and he and Mick's last turning point had been passed. From now on, like Popolok and its dead twin, they were lost to sanity and to all hope of life. They rounded the bend and the ruins of Pt.3 came into sight. Their domesticated imaginations had never conceived of a sight so unspeakably brutal. Perhaps in the battlefields of Europe as many corpses had been heaped together, but had so many of them been women and children locked together with corpses of men? There had been piles of dead as high, but ever so many recently abundant with life? There had been cities laid waste even as quickly, but ever an entire city lost to the simple dictate of gravity? It was a sight beyond sickness. In the face of it, the mind slowed to a snail's pace. The forces of reason picked over the evidence with meticulous hands, searching for a flaw in it, a place where it could say, "This is not happening. This is a dream of death, not death itself." But reason could find no weakness in this wall. This was true. It was death indeed. Pt.3 had fallen. 38,765 citizens were spread over the ground, or rather flung in ungainly seeping piles over it. Those who had not died of the fall or of suffocation were still dying. There would be no survivors from that city except that bundle of onlookers that had traipsed out of their homes to watch the contest. Those few Pt.3ans, the crippled, the sick, the ancient few were now staring, like Mick and Judd, at the carnage, trying not to believe. Judd was the first out of the car. The ground beneath his swades was sticky with coagulating gore. He surveyed the carnage. There was no wreckage, no sign of a plane crash, no fire, no smell of fuel, just tens of thousands of fresh bodies, all either naked or dressed in an identical gray serge, men, women, and child alike. Some of them, he could see, wore leather harnesses, tightly buckled around their upper chests, and snaking out from these contraptions were lengths of rope, miles and miles of it. The closer he looked, the more he saw the extraordinary system of knots and lashings that still held the bodies together. For some reason, these people had been tied together side by side. Some were yoked on their neighbors' shoulders, straddling them like boys playing at horseback riding. Others were locked arm in arm, knitted together with threads of rope in a wall of muscle and bone. Yet others were trussed in a ball, their heads tucked between their knees. All were in some way connected up with their fellows, tied together as though in some insane collective bondage game. Another shot. Mick looked up. Across the field, a solitary man dressed in a drab overcoat was walking amongst the bodies with a revolver, dispatching the dying. It was a pitifully inadequate act of mercy, but he went on nevertheless, choosing the suffering children first, emptying the revolver, filling it again, emptying it, filling it, emptying it. Mick let go. He yelled at the top of his voice over the moans of the injured, "What is this?" The man looked up from his appalling duty, his face as dead gray as his coat. "Huh?" he grunted, frowning at the two interlopers through his thick spectacles. "What's happening here?" Mick shouted across at him. It felt good to shout. It felt good to sound angry at the man. Maybe he was to blame. It would be a fine thing just to have someone to blame. "Tell us!" Mick said. He could hear the tears throbbing in his voice. Tell us, for God's sake. Explain this. Greycoat shook his head. He didn't understand a word this young idiot was saying. It was English he spoke, but that's all he knew. Mick began to walk toward him, feeling all the time the eyes of the dead on him. Eyes like black shining gems set in broken faces, eyes looking at him upside down on heads severed from their seating. Eyes in the heads that had solid howls for voices. Eyes in heads beyond howls, beyond breath. Thousands of eyes. He reached Greycoat, whose gun was almost empty. He had taken off his spectacles and thrown them aside. He, too, was weeping. Little jerks ran through his big, ungainly body. At Mick's feet, somebody was reaching out for him. He didn't want to look, but the hand touched his shoe, and he had no choice but to see its owner. A young man, lying like a flesh swastika, every joint smashed. A child lay under him, her bloody legs poking out like two pink sticks. He wanted the man's revolver to stop the hand from touching him. Better still, he wanted a machine gun, a flamethrower, anything to wipe all this agony away. As he looked up from the broken body, Mick saw Greycoat raise the revolver. "Judd," he said, but as the word left his lips, the muzzle of the revolver slipped into Greycoat's mouth and the trigger was pulled. Greycoat had saved the last bullet for himself. The back of his head opened up like a dropped egg, the shell of his skull flying off. His body went limp and sank to the ground, the revolver still between his lips. "We must," began Mick, saying the words to nobody. "We must..." What was the imperative? In this situation, what must they do? "We must..." Judd was behind him. "Help," he said to Mick. Yes. We have to get help. We must go. Go! That was what they must do. On any pretext, for any fragile, cowardly reason, they must go. Get out of the battlefield, get out of the reach of a dying hand with a wound in place of a body. We have to tell the authorities. Find a town. Get some help. Priests, said Mick. They need priests. That was absurd. To think of giving the last rites to so many people, it would take an army of priests, a water cannon filled with holy water, a loudspeaker to pronounce the benedictions. They turned away together from the horror and wrapped their arms around each other, then picked their way through the carnage to the car. But it was occupied. Václav Jolovsek was sitting behind the wheel and trying to start the Volkswagen. He turned the ignition key once, twice. Third time the engine caught and the wheels span in the crimson mud as he put her into reverse and backed down the track. Václav saw the Englishman running towards the car, cursing him. There was no help for it. He didn't want to steal the vehicle, but he had work to do. He'd been a referee. He'd been responsible for the contest and the safety of the contestants. One of those heroic cities had already fallen, and he must do everything in his power to prevent Popolok from following its twin. He must chase the city, reason with it, talk it down out of its terrors with quiet words and promises. If he failed, there would be another disaster, the equal of the one in front of him, and his conscience was already broken enough. Mick was still chasing the VW, shouting at Jolovsek. The thief took no notice, concentrating on maneuvering the car back down the narrow, slippery track. Mick was losing the chase rapidly. The car had begun to pick up speed. Furious, but without the breath to speak his fury, Mick stood in the road, hands on knees, heaving and sobbing. "Bastard!" said Judd. Mick looked down the track. Their car had already disappeared. Fucker couldn't even drive properly. We have to catch up, Mick said through gulps of breath. How? On foot. We haven't even got a map. That's in the car. Jesus Christ almighty. They walked down the track together, away from the field. After a few meters, the tide of blood began to peter out. Just a few congealing rivulets dribbled towards the main road. Mick and Judd followed the bloody tire marks to the junction. The Serbovic road was empty in both directions. The tire marks showed a left turn. "He's gone deeper into the hills," said Judd, staring along the lonely road towards the blue-green distance. "He's out of his mind." So come back next time to find out what our unfortunate strangers in this strange land have in store for them. Until then, stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.